History has marked Dragon Ball as one of the most abundant franchises in titles for the video game industry, going through different genres, RPG, adventure, but mainly without ever losing the fighting factor. Today we have an appointment to review that genre and the many legendary Dragon Ball games that have marked what the Butoden saga is, with a journey of more than 20 years. This is the evolution of the fighting genre in Dragon Ball Z. (16-bits era) Dragon Ball Z Super Butoden. Published by Bandai, of course, Super Butoden would become the first Dragon Ball game to give the fans of the show what they wanted as an interactive experience, changing the formula that many tried without much success and becoming the pillar of this unforgettable saga of games. Its official release date was March 20th, 1993. This thing is older than me. Developed by the TOS company for the Super Nintendo, also known in Europe as simply Dragon Ball Z. You know, the Dragon Ball Z game. To talk about what made this delivery great above the others that had already existed, the arrival of the split screen is crucial. This was the element that changed every possibility that the players had imagined, allowing a wider combat scenario to be able to develop the fights. Being a 2D fighting game that offered great mobility for the time, it looked more full of life than anything else ever seen trying to represent the story of Dragon Ball. As for basic controls, it had punch and kick attacks, energy blast, blocking, and the possibility of flying. Also special attacks, of course. Regarding fidelity, we're talking about the year 1993. At this point, unlike what many think, in the series we were in the Cell saga in the middle of the tournament. That's why here there's a lack of material. Not all the possible characters from the anime were available. But if one thing is true, it's that working with what they have available offered great fights. I know that by this point we have already seen things with incredibly high frame rate. The power of the Super Nintendo is nothing like what we have seen on the channel, and it could seem a little rough, like in slow motion, with many flaws, and although that's not always the case, if we have to recognize the great advance that this game meant for the players, Super Butoden seriously strives to be more than just a punch and kick simulator. Its main mode is the story, representing the most important combat so far. The curious thing is that before each combat, they allow you to choose which fighter you wanted to face the mission with, and if you choose the corresponding character, and if you didn't lose any fight on the highest difficulty, the game rewarded you with the true ending, or the canon, so to call it. Then we clearly had the versus mode against the CPU and the tournament mode. Another of the great factors that contributed to the recognition of this game were the special attacks, which showed a lot of fidelity. They represented the greatness of the energy attacks of the series, which, well, far from being a fast and dynamic sequence, they remained with the elements that allow you to return the attack, deflect it, or respond to it. Thing that hasn't been seen until this moment, with Street Fighter II as the most marked reference. Super Butoden has transcended over the years. Obviously, after this success, there had to be a sequel. So let's go with Super Butoden 2. On December 17, 1993, just a few months after the first delivery, this game, which is considered the best of the first trilogy, arrived. Arriving in Europe under the name of The Legend of the Saiyan. To get directly to the point, Super Butoden 2 took everything previously explored in the first game and boosted it in a huge way. The split screen was used again, the colors were much more vivid, the plane of each character was more notable, the graphics improved slightly, the spectacularity of the techniques was also benefited. Everything indicated that it would be a responsive success once again. The quantity and quality of the scenarios available for each fight was greater. Regarding the gameplay in a more specific way, since in the previous game we could perform these special attacks, now the possibility of hitting it with our own energy attack was added, making the spectacularity shine even more. We also had special rush attacks that unleashed a combination of special hits unique to each character, which were pretty fun for the time. It was developed again with a story mode, but this time it related the Cell saga completely and also giving rise to the OVAs like the one of Bojack and Broly, making these characters playable too, and consequently the roster of characters would be much wider. A game that at a playable level I don't know how long it could sustain over the time. Yes, it's true that for many people it can be difficult to get used to it in this time, but without doubt it's one of the best Dragon Ball games from the most important 16-bit era for an entire generation. At the end of 1994, all fans of the Butoden game saga were waiting for a new delivery, since the anime had advanced considerably and there were hopes for a new game. They got it, but nothing could prepare them for the great disappointment they got. Arriving on December 29, 1994, Super Butoden 3 was released, telling the events of the beginning of the Buu saga, this being the main cover of the game. If you can describe this game with one word, would be slow. When the title came out, something the vast majority of players agree on was the game feeling. The fluidity of every aspect of the game's movement was extremely slow. Everything was a disaster. From what was once the new split screen now felt like a disordered deployment of angles, with attacks that now didn't change the perspective, giving confusion to the gameplay in general. The attack moves were slower in each fighter, while in the first two deliveries the concept of combos as such was still not existing. It didn't feel like a factor that hindered the gameplay. It let the simulation of the combats be very successful. But in Super Butoden 3, a combat seemed eternal due to how frustrating it could become. As a very questionable decision, the story mode was completely removed. Bandai didn't want this delivery to repeat the story already executed in the first and second game. I want to believe that due to the lack of time or simply wanting to release a product with new characters as quickly as possible, they ended up giving what no one needed. A mediocre game system, rushed with only one versus mode that can't stand on itself due to the gameplay problems, and finally an incredibly reduced roster of characters. They had the roster of the Buu saga, but not even characters like Piccolo, Gotenks, or any Earthling warrior was included. It was a disappointment. The fans got a tough punch in what would be the reception of the Dragon Ball games from then on. A forgettable episode, but which was far from being the end of this story. The developers in TOS still had plans in mind. Dragon Ball Z Shin Butoden, this time in an exclusive format for Japan, marking limits with its release to other countries and being exclusive for the Sega Saturn, a direct sequel to the Super Butoden trilogy on Super Nintendo. And why did this happen? This was Sega's response to what would be the Dragon Ball Z Ultimate Battle 22, an exclusive game for the Sony console, the PlayStation. It showed good progress in gameplay and a good number of characters for the time. So Sega decided that what better way to respond than reviving a saga of games that, at least in its first two titles, were absolutely great for their time, the Butoden, giving birth to Shin Butoden on November 17, 1995. Wow, this was a triumphal return for the saga because, in smaller words, this was considered by many the best 2D Dragon Ball in history. We have several game modes which highlighted the team combat, 5 against 5, where once we defeated the first one, his partner appeared and so on until the team that was running out of fighters would be the loser. The game has an exceptional roster of characters, 26 in total, but within it we see Super Saiyan 3 Goku, Super Saiyan 2 Gohan, Gogeta, good villains such as Broly, Frieza, Buu, and others, giving great variety to the fights, which could rarely be achieved with the technical resources of the time. Let's pass on its great virtue, the sprites. That technical section of the gameplay that makes it shine, a very successful artistic choice. The combination of the sprites with the environment is simply wonderful. It almost looks like we are controlling the characters of the series. All its poses, movement animations and so on are little calls from the show, and that makes it a very special game. Of course, that alone would not be enough to be the excellent game that it was. We also have to add its excellent execution at the time of combat. The divided screen is preserved, the special attacks now have a more respectable representation. The blows were implemented pretty well, even though they could have a little exaggerated effect on the rival by throwing him back more and more, and it gave a feeling that you could never do a combination of consecutive attacks without the rival going away from your hitting range. However, it didn't affect the gameplay to a great extent. The fans were grateful to Sega because they took the saga for a good purpose at the end. Another game mode that also drew a lot of attention was Hercule, a concept that makes good use of this peculiar character. We enter a martial arts tournament and they give us a lot of tools so that Hercule can interact with them, and we must decide what to do. Our goal is to earn money, and the great thing is that we do it by betting. So we can do different things, from giving gifts to the fighter on which we are betting on, so that they get motivated, all the way to using traps and dirty tricks to harm the result of the opponent. It's not a super innovative section, but it does provide a fresh air among so many spectacular fights that this game offers. Small details that show care for the material the developers are working with. Finally, Shin Butoden would be framed as one of the few who has kept the Butoden legacy alive. Hyperdimension. We go to 1996, on March 29 to be exact, where the latest title released for the Super Nintendo of this type would be waiting for us. A game that would end up by reivindicating the third delivery of Super Butoden. In order to not be left with a closing that was not with a golden class, the attempt was made and it was achieved. This was the result. The most important aspect that characterized Hyperdimension from its predecessors as a saga was the disappearance of the split screen, an element that had been there during the entire journey of the saga, but against every prediction, it ended up benefiting the gameplay that this title proposed. Gameplay, which far from being well received at the beginning, generated many doubts because the ideas were kind of unready. First, the combat focused more on hand-to-hand, leaving the key attacks and spectacular combinations of energy in the background. What's more, this could now be pretty risky since our life bar no longer acted as such, but it was also a mixed life meter. This means that the power you executed, a little piece of your life would be taken away as well. Something like the gaze from Rock Lee if you want to see it that way. But this also comes with the benefits that if you charge energy, the life bar also increased. When I saw this, I thought, these guys are crazy. First, because the fights would become eternal if the gameplay was not frenetic enough to keep both players constantly attacking, then refilling their bar to give them time to have infinite life. And also because they were indirectly punishing the players for using a mechanic that in previous games was probably what made them fall in love with the entire saga, the key special attacks. But please note that this wasn't like this. The number of characters at this time could not be very excessive, especially with the 16 bits of the Super Nintendo, so the selection of fighters in my opinion could not have been better. We have Goku, Vegeta, Gotenks, Adult Gohan, Piccolo, Frieza, Cell, Boo, Kid Buu, and Vegito, which would be an addition that would go on the cover to attract more public, of course. Vegito was a character who had virtually no participation in the games, and here we had it only on the cover. The gameplay was excellent and was what a lot of people were used to. They were really not prepared. From Hyperdimension, the combo section was added. Now it was possible to combine the normal blows along with special attacks. Attacks that had different block stunts and different recovery frames, which gives rise even to small juggles. Combo chaining sections that already started to have more shape from this game. The new mechanics were many. We had perfect block, we had hit cancellation with jumps, there were counters that could be very useful. The story mode has an interesting approach, accompanying us from the end of the Frieza saga all the way to the entire Buu saga, including Kid Buu. Something that I feel was an absent factor were combats that never existed, thanks to certain characters like Future Trunks not appearing in the game at all. But well, it's a concept only seen in Japan, since the story mode didn't come to Europe. Regarding the combination of the life bar with the energy bar, this was balanced, making the life reduced very fast. In this way, regenerating life through the ki was not a broken mechanic, but more like a necessary factor to not become a vulnerable punching bag. In the end, this game demonstrated above all things great depth in the combat, an aspect that hasn't been seen until that moment, and I feel that the value it has is enormous. Even thanks to this project, many other developers have been encouraged to follow their steps to explore more the concept of chaining combos in these combats. Dragon Ball Kai Ultimate Butoden. Many may think that I am overlooking Dragon Ball Final Bout, developed by Toast 2, but if you allow me, I would like to make a video dedicated only to that game. You have been asking for that game a lot in the comments, and I don't want to miss the opportunity. Expected very soon also on the channel. Going on a time skip of 15 years to the Nintendo DS platform, the time came to talk about one of the most popular games of the saga, one of the fans' favorite Butoden. Kai Ultimate Butoden was released on February 3rd, 2011, as you already heard, for the curious Nintendo Portable Console. The game was officially announced in an issue of the Shokan Shonen Jump with an article specifying the arrival of a new fighting game with 3D graphics from the Dragon Ball franchise, a game that, according to the sources, would extend to the Cell Saga in its story mode, but that was nothing compared to how much they shined with this game. It had 51 characters. Clearly the increase in terms of characters was exorbitant compared to what we saw in Super Nintendo or even in Sega Saturn. Characters like King Kai, one of the only fighters that hasn't been in the majority of Dragon Ball games, it's a character that was added out of mere affection that should be noted. He has skills that reference moments from the series, like when he uses his car, and it's very entertaining to use. Also, despite having several characters repeated but in different transformations, each of these played differently, and that is actually what makes one character unique from the other. Take Sasuke as an example in Naruto Storm 4. His version of the 5 Kages mid is virtually identical to his version of Eternal Mangekyo, but we all already know that both characters play in infinitely different ways, having animations of movement, punches, grabs, tilts, and different jutsus. That's what happens here, plus this plays in favor of the story mode of the game. I don't know about you guys, but I personally like it a lot, and I appreciate that a Dragon Ball title takes the best to represent the greatest possible number of arcs and sagas that are in Dragon Ball Z, and this game completely does it from Raditz all the way to the end of Kid Buu. And this happens to me because many games in the time between 2000s and 2010s tended to leave the games in badly finished sagas. Sometimes they didn't have chronological order, sometimes they were not canon, and that doesn't seem bad to me, but I appreciate that the games show dedication when it's time to make us feel in the universe that we like so much. And what better way to do it than with an order, faithful, and respectable story mode. The changes in gameplay are abysmal compared to Super Butoden or even Hyper Dimension. The energy bar could no longer be charged, and now it was gradually regenerated according to the hits you received and dealt. There are no in-game transformations, and the special techniques had mini quick time events to get them right. We have light hit and hard hit, a button to dodge, which could be split into various functions. We can dodge, recover, counterattack, continue dodging, like a minigame that is played between rivals. An element that represents in a great way what Dragon Ball combats are in the series, and which ends up contributing to a gameplay that, in my taste, is the most agile, dynamic, and frenetic of the Butoden games that have existed so far. Everything combined with an art trying to be something a little joyful because of the proportionality of the character's head, but which tips to be one of the most entertaining combat systems I've ever seen. There's also a combo breaker, a mechanic seen in several fighting games. Let's put it in this way: it gives possibilities to both you and your opponent because the artificial intelligence in the story mode, arcade, tournament, and others is impressively well developed. The CPU is an excellent rival which can camouflage boredom when not playing with a friend. I would like to talk a little more about the ultimates, these definitive attacks which are really very well worked. combining perfectly with the split screen of the Nintendo DS so that they look spectacular. They even have animation nuances which are really excellent. Specifically, it's a game that, being as different from the gaming philosophy proposed by Super Nintendo's Butoden, has very positive points, which it was able to use very well to create this authentic game. As we all know, in 2015, Extreme Butoden would arrive, a game which we talked about in the previous chapter of Dragon Ball games. For the Nintendo 3DS console, a game that took many bases from traditional games and included deep game mechanics. But if we want to talk about deep, we have to go one step further. You and I know what game I'm talking about. It didn't come out under the name of the Butoden franchise, but it's a living example of its inspiration. Arc System Works would give us a master project, which deserves its own entire chapter talking about it. We have that appointment for next week. I thank you a lot if you got to the end of this video. Believe me, very few people do it. I know that some games were missing to cover, for example Dragon Ball Z Taiketsu, which is considered one of the worst ones. We had Ultimate Battle 22 or Final Bout. As I already told you, it will have its own independent video. But they are games that I consider not very according to the theme we are looking for, relating the story of the genre at this moment. I'll see you all next week and be ready because something big is coming. That was all for today, guys, and I'll be watching you in the next video. Take care and see ya.